Hello, everyone. We have Dr. Brian Fife here today to talk about the history of the U.S. election and how we got here. And on Election Day, I am very excited for this wonderful presentation. Thank you, Dr. Fife.
Well, thank you, Declan, and thanks to your group. It's nice to join this wonderful event on such a historic day. I have been around for a few years, and I would say this is definitely the most important election in my lifetime. You really have two very different presidential candidates and very different candidates in terms of their vision and their understanding of democracy and our institutions in society. To me, this discussion is really all about civic engagement, and truly the election is all about the vitality of our American democracy. So I'm going to briefly highlight 5 things, and then I certainly welcome questions from anyone who wishes to do so. First, very brief summary of the history of Election Day in the United States. On March 1st, 1792, Congress passed a law that stipulated that states had to conduct their presidential elections anytime during a 34-day period of time before the first Wednesday in December. That was the law until 1845. And the interesting thing about the change in the law is that it was due to technology. In 1845, Americans were shocked with this neat thing called the telegraph, where you could instantly communicate information across long distances. So in 1845, Election Day was officially established in the way that we think of it. The Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And so ever since 1845, we have been using the same date. And I would argue our society has changed just a little since 1845. In the mid-19th century, the US was primarily an agrarian society, and truly that early November date made sense and was opportune for a lot of farmers. So think about it, in 1845, when this law was established, we had about 20 million Americans in this country. James Knox Polk was president. He was the 11th president, and nothing has changed ever since, truly. Things could change if we wanted it to. Under Article 1, state legislatures have the power to regulate elections in their states. However, at any time, Congress can, no pun intended, trump state law and pass a law which would change the nature and the way that states conduct their elections. My second point I want to make is how our election is so different than in other democracies. And here's my comparison. There are 36 member nations of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. These are generally regarded as the 36 richest democracies on earth. Of the 36, 27 of them conduct their national elections on the weekend. So in that sense, the US is an outlier. In South Korea, it's a national holiday. I would argue that the 1845 law may have made sense then, and it certainly did. However, it does not make very much sense today. What it does is it limits democracy because it inhibits full participation in the democratic and electoral processes. If the US changed our law and Election Day, and I've always advocated election weekend, where it would be a true national holiday. And I think the time period in early November has been institutionalized, and I think it's fine. But what I would like to see is Election Day, truly election weekend, and encourage more people to participate in the health and vibrancy of the democracy. My third component of my discussion today are the structural rules of our elections. According to the US Elections Project, there are about 257 million adults in this country. That is to say, the voting age population, all those 18 and older. Unfortunately, in this country, only 80% of all adults are registered. And I use the term unfortunate intentionally because in most democracies, the government automatically registers its citizens. The citizen doesn't have to do anything. The burden of proof is entirely on the government to register the citizen as soon as age and residency requirements are met. In the US, the burden of proof almost everywhere, with one notable exception, the burden of proof is on the citizen. So if you do not register, you are not eligible to vote in 49 states and the District of Columbia. The one exception is the state of North Dakota. Think about North Dakota. Since 1951, that's almost 70 years. Since 1951, the state government of North Dakota automatically registers its citizens. So if North Dakota could do it for almost 70 years, my guess is other states could do the same. Under current law, and this was the result of a 1972 Supreme Court decision, states can require up to 30 days to compel you to register in advance of the election. In 1972, Tennessee had 60-day requirement, and that was challenged. And think about what the justices said back in the year that Richard Nixon was reelected to a second term. They argued that based on the technology, the computer technology of that time, 30 days was reasonable. A lot has changed with computers. To those of us who've been around for a few years and seen those old huge IBM mainframes, you can go to buy a car or a truck and get credit in 5 minutes because of computer technology. So I think it's unfortunate that some states, in fact, about half of the states require almost up to that full 30 days. And I think it's more of a barrier, and an intended one, frankly, than anything else. We have heard a lot about almost 100 million people have already voted, and I think that's really neat. What we don't know is what voter turnout is going to be, because that remains to be seen. A typical voter turnout in this country, and please know that in my own biased perspective, I hope it's higher than this. A typical turnout would be about 55% of the voting age population. And if 2020 is like that, we will continue to be amongst the lowest voter turnout in the free world. Let's say that it is 55%. And again, my values stipulate that I hope it's higher. If 55% of the voting age population votes, that'll be about 142 million people. What it will also mean is that 45% of the potential electorate will not vote, and that's about 115 million people. Again, voter turnout could be higher. Just by way of comparison, we haven't hit 60% of the voting age population since 1968. So it's been a while since we have hit that 60% threshold. And I think it would be neat if we did in this particular election, but it'll take a while to figure that out. There is a value to voting. And what I would argue is that two prominent Americans in a bipartisan way have really started and launched a neat project on the value of voting and the value of civic participation. The two people I'm talking about are the retired Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman ever appointed to the Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan back in 1981. Several years ago, she joined forces with Lee Hamilton. Sandra Day O'Connor is a lifetime Republican. Lee Hamilton, a lifetime Democrat. He was a congressman from Southern Indiana for 34 years. He was also the chair of the September 11th Commission, someone whose integrity is well respected across the political spectrum. Their point is, and what they emphasize is how shocking it really is that Americans know so little about their own democracy. And so what they wish to do through their civic education campaign is to encourage states and even Congress to do whatever government can do and school systems can do to enhance our civic education initiative in this country. Okay, the fourth part of my presentation is what is at stake in 2020. We obviously know that the presidency is at stake in 2020. And if you've been following the news, and I know, by the way, that this sounds similar to 2016. It really sounds like it's Joe Biden's race to lose. He has a commanding lead, not only in national popular polls. Of course, the popular vote doesn't necessarily give you the job. You need 270 of 538 electoral college votes. And we know what happened 4 years ago on that front. Biden also has a commanding lead based on the aggregate averages, weekly averages of statewide polls, especially in key battleground states such as the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So you keep hearing this phrase from 4 years ago, Trump ran an inside straight, which I think is a very accurate description of what happened. Because when you think of the three states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, combined, he won them by about 70,000 votes. Very close races, less than 1% in all of those three key states. So the presidency is at stake, but also, and this has been highlighted with battles about Supreme Court appointments, as well as all appointments to the federal judiciary, there are 35 Senate seats being contested of the 100 that exist. 23 of them have Republican incumbents and 12 of them have Democratic incumbents. Right now, going into the election, the Republicans have a 53 to 47 majority. There are many noteworthy analysts based on, again, aggregate weekly averages of statewide polls that have predicted that it is likely the Democrats will regain numeric majority of the US Senate following these elections. Now, of course, when you predict something, people are impressed when you're right. And oftentimes people are not right. But besides the importance of Pennsylvania, there are two Senate races going on in Georgia, which we may not know the outcome until early January, because if the candidates don't get a simple majority plus one under Georgia law, there's an automatic runoff election early next year. And that could, in theory, happen in both of those races. The fact that there is speculation, again, based on the polls, and this absolutely may not happen, obviously, but the fact that there is widespread speculation that Biden could carry Georgia and the Democrats are highly competitive in both Senate seats is maybe a broader indication of what's happening nationally. And also I would throw in Texas. Most assume Texas will likely be carried by Trump, but for years, Texas has been a safe Republican state. And the fact that Biden is very competitive, statistically tied in many polls, is a bit of a surprise. The third point of the important triangle, the presidency, the Senate, the House of Representatives, all 435 seats are being contested. Democrats currently have a majority. There are 235 Democrats, 197 Republicans, one Libertarian, a former Republican who left the party and officially is a Libertarian now, Justin Amash from Michigan, and there are 5 vacancies. Charlie Cook and others project that the Democrats will likely pick up to double-digit seats, maybe around a dozen or so. Again, time will tell soon enough on that front. What are the issues at stake in 2020? I want to cite what I think is a very representative poll of the top issues. This is according to the people, not according to me. Top issue is the economy. Number 2 issue is the COVID-19 pandemic. The number 3 issue, and some of these will sound familiar because they really have been in current news for months or at least weeks: criminal justice and policing. 4th, race relations. 5th, healthcare. And 6th, immigration. It's interesting to me that there are at least two noteworthy issues that are not on that list. And it's not surprising because of the current pandemic and the economic situation that we're in. One is climate change. To many, certainly in the scientific and scholarly communities, it's the most important issue of our time. Keep in mind that Americans tend to de-emphasize environmental issues in a time of crisis. And I think we're witnessing that right now. The other issue, and the figures were just released last month in October, we have a total national debt in excess of 27 trillion. Now the fiscal year for 2020 ended on September 30th. And very quietly, I mean, the press reported it, but it didn't get much coverage, certainly in the campaign. The old budget deficit record, that's for 1 year, 1 fiscal year, the old record of 1.4 trillion from 11 years ago has in fact been shattered. The budget deficit for fiscal year 2020 was 3.1 trillion, meaning that the government spent 3.1 trillion more than it brought in by way of revenue. And so, again, I would argue that the total national debt, and it's particularly for young people, is something that is cause for consternation. It's cause for consternation because people my age and older, at least through our decision makers, have not made the tough choices needed to truly have balanced budgets. And so we pass that legacy on to younger people. And it will not dramatically overnight, but it will erode the quality of life if it continues to be ignored and we continue to run high budget deficits year after year. Okay, so the 5th part of my presentation and what I'll close my words with are how can elections in the United States be made more democratic? And I'm going to offer some ideas, and they may or may not be plausible from your perspective, and certainly you may have other ideas as well. One thing I would like to see happen are public financing of all federal campaigns. That would include the House, the Senate, and the presidential races. In 1907, Teddy Roosevelt, who was president at the time, said in his State of the Union address, he asked Congress to pass a bill that would provide for publicly financed campaigns. Now, in 1907, he meant for the presidency and the House, because in 1907, the people couldn't directly elect senators yet. That would happen in the next decade with the 17th Amendment. Teddy Roosevelt was heavily criticized in 1904, where he won. The first modern landslide, by the way, was really in 1904. Roosevelt won a very big election over Judge Alton Parker, the Democrat from New York. And Parker accused Roosevelt of being effectively bought and paid off by banks and big corporations. So what Roosevelt requested to Congress is that let's take that issue off the agenda. The perception that politicians are bought and paid off is still a perception that exists to this day. So in that sense, Teddy Roosevelt was right. But it's been 113 years and there has been nothing passed in Congress, and it is unlikely that that will happen anytime soon. Many conservatives view public financing as a usurpation of free speech under the First Amendment. The second thing I would like to see happen to have more democratic elections is for all states to have automatic registration, like North Dakota. If not that, my home state of Maine in 1973 passed a law that provided for same day, it's also known as election day registration, where a citizen could walk into election, today. Today in Maine, if a citizen is not registered, she or he can go in, register, and then cast a legal vote. In many states, if you haven't registered in advance of a specific date, such as Pennsylvania, then you're ineligible to vote by definition. A third thing I would like to see happen, and we have seen some progress and maybe in some areas some regression at the same time, make it easier for people to vote by having more early voting, less waits on election day, and a more robust mail-in voting program. We've heard a lot about the implausibility and the fraud of mail-in elections. 5 states have been doing their elections purely by mail-in, on a mail-in basis for several years. So there is literally no tangible evidence to suggest that that is a fraudulent process at all. So anything we can do to make it easier so citizens aren't standing in line for 6 to 8 hours, especially in predominantly minority neighborhoods, then we should be doing it, in my opinion. A fourth reform I would propose is to allow felons who have paid their criminal penalty and so-called debt to society to have their voting rights restored. Now, in 2 states, Maine and Vermont, a person who is literally in jail can still vote by absentee. But in some states, a convicted felon may lose her or his voting rights for the rest of their life. And that's very unfortunate. Even if they move to another state, there are cases, and Stacey Abrams has a neat book about this, about voter suppression. There are some states where citizens have had their voting rights restored because they paid their debt to society. I'm talking about felons, but they move to another state and they lose their voting privileges all over again. And I think that's really unfortunate and discriminatory on many levels. Another thing I would add to the list is the practice of gerrymandering that's been going on for literally 200 years. Gerrymandering is the redrawing of legislative district boundaries to advantage a particular party and to disadvantage the rival party. State legislatures have the authority to redraw not only legislative districts for state races, state Senate and state House. State legislatures in most states also have the authority to redraw the legislative district boundaries for US House seats as well. And if that process, and some states do it this way already, could be, instead of having this process undertaken by partisans in state legislatures, a more of a merit commission model, I believe, would be preferable. Each person's vote, no matter who she or he is, or where she or he lives should be equally weighted. And gerrymandering does not allow for that to happen in many regions in this country. So that kind of takes us to where we are today in what promises to be not only a fascinating evening, and I have no idea how much we will know. There are some states where we do expect results, especially a big state like Florida. But there are other states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin whose mail-in ballots may take several days to receive and count beyond today. So I have no idea what we will definitively know. We may know some key states, and by knowing Florida and maybe even Georgia or North Carolina, if any of those were in the Biden category, it might be demonstrative to what's happening nationally. So I would certainly welcome any questions that any of you would have.
Thank you, Professor Fife. I have one question. You had talked about, when you talked about Georgia, how it seems like in certain areas the country is becoming a lot more blue. Do you think this is a response in just the way our citizens, our fellow citizens, are more left-leaning across the country, or do you believe this is a response to Trump or a response to Biden?
I think it's a response to both candidates in the context of the times in which we live. America has long been described as a right of center country. And I'm talking about within a comparative context in the free world, that America is fairly conservative. And I don't think, and I would say that the evidence is Joe Biden won the Democratic nomination and not Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. To some of us who have been around, that's a similar scenario to 1992 when Democrats nominated more of a centrist in Bill Clinton. Because, you know, in 80, 84, and 88, the Democrats took a big beating electorally. I mean, all three elections by historical accounts were landslide elections, especially 80 and 84. In 84, Reagan won 49 of the 50 states. So it was a big victory, and he won, imagine he won the popular vote by 18%. That's something staggering compared to what we've seen in recent elections. So I think it's more a reflection of citizens are doing something that arguably they started to do 2 years ago. Remember what happened in the 2018 midterms? You know, going into it, the Republicans controlled the House, the Senate, and of course the White House. Presidency wasn't at stake. The Republicans maintained control of the Senate, but in terms of the House, they lost control of the House. And you know, from that perspective, the speakership went from Paul Ryan to Nancy Pelosi. So that was a big loss for the Republicans. But voter turnout was 46.5% of the voting age population, which is compared to the last 3 midterm elections, it was at least 12% higher. I mean, and I know this sounds somewhat ludicrous because 46.5% isn't that stellar, but we hadn't hit 40% or higher, or excuse me, 45% or higher in a midterm election in half a century. So what prompted more people to vote? And it could be, in speculation, is that it was Donald Trump in terms of his supporters, but also those who opposed him vehemently. And so I think if Georgia does turn out somewhat bluish, I think it may be a repudiation of the current president in particular, and a mobilization of voter turnout, especially in Atlanta and the suburbs of Atlanta. And so I think it's a combination of those things, but keep in mind something else. When you have an incumbent president seeking a second term. People have a full term upon which to evaluate. In 2016, we had 2 candidates who were not incumbents, so it was a different dynamic altogether. Donald Trump's current approval rating in Gallup, I use that because it's a consistent measure since the late 1930s to today, is currently running at 44%. Now, most of the time when you're an incumbent and you're seeking a second term, under normal circumstances, I'm not saying today fits that description necessarily, but you'd want to be as high, over 50% as you could. Donald Trump's, at least in Gallup, his highest approval rating in his entire tenure is 49%. He's never hit the 50% mark. He's the only president since Harry Truman to never hit the 50% mark. And of course, even if he loses, his term's not over. So that could change before January 20th, of course. But Donald Trump has been very popular with a subset, a sizable one, certainly, 40 to 45%, a sizable one, but he's never had 50% or more of Americans say that they approve of the way he's doing his job. So his approval ratings are historically low by comparison.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
If no one has another question, I have another question on a different topic, but I think I want to say Friday or Thursday, one of the big things that was on the news was the Biden bus incident and the rise of violence and presence of guns at polling stations. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what you see as a parallel to what we see right now with what's happened in the past of our American history.
That's an excellent question. The context of the past is certainly different. I personally, and this is a value judgment, others would not feel this way, but in those states that have open carry laws, I think it would be intimidating to go and vote and see a weapon, particularly one that could do massive harm to people, the community, in a very short period of time. So I guess it depends on what one perceives as what is harassment or voter intimidation. The incident in Texas or New Jersey, I think those incidents are unacceptable, and I would rebuke the president for not condemning them, because in my mind, he's fomenting potential violence. And think about the violent nature that going back in time historically, this country was born in violence so that we could be a democracy. And think of the first real transition from one party to another occurred from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson. And the beautiful thing about what happened at that time on March 4th, 1801, is that it was done peacefully, and that pattern was sustained ever since. And historically, Richard Nixon lost a very close race in 1960, and there were allegations of voter fraud then. But he did not take the advice of some, and he decided to respect what he believed to be the wishes of the American people, given the structural rules that we have. And so he walked away. More recently, we had a debacle in this country 20 years ago between George W. Bush and Al Gore. A debacle in that we were watching on television these election officials in Florida staring at hanging chads on those old punch card ballots. That determined, in the judicial battles that followed, and ultimately in Bush versus Gore, that led to something that was unique. 34 days after Election Day, which was November 7th, 20 years ago, when the Supreme Court issued its ruling, Al Gore gave what really was his second concession speech. But if you go back and look at that speech, its historical overtones going back to Jefferson and Adams, I think, are very significant, because he said, while he vehemently disagreed with the court's decision by a 5-4 margin, he was going to respect the rule of law, and he did not want to carry on the dispute any further because he thought it would cause possible harm to the nation via potential violence. And so one can argue he did an honorable thing, which must have been very difficult. And so the current president, and perhaps he'll surprise us later tonight, has not conducted himself in a manner that is consistent with the history of democratic elections. And I'll also throw in, I mean, arguably the most fraudulent election we've had in this country was in 1876. Samuel Tilden won the popular vote over Rutherford B. Hayes by 3%. But the electoral votes of 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, were in dispute. And so for literally months, a dispute was settled. And, you know, Tilden is leading in the electoral vote going into the dispute. He's won the popular vote outright. And all 20 of those electoral votes from those 3 states went to Hayes, and that was the closest election we've ever had. In those days, you needed 185 to win. Hayes received 185, Tilden received 184, and that was the closest race. Was he wronged? Undoubtedly so. But given the structural rules that existed, he did not dispute it. And he did, I think many would argue he did the honorable thing, because at some point democracy isn't well served when we have people battling and doing horrible things to one another in the streets. So I don't personally think the president has set a good example, whether it's race relations with Charlottesville, his truly inability to discredit and reject white nationalism and other specific groups. So I sincerely hope that none of that is witnessed tonight or in the days that ensue.
One follow-up question to what you were talking about with the courts. I wonder what you thought about the Kavanaugh write-up of the most recent decision from the Supreme Court about the elections, and what you think about Trump's comments, I believe last night, about having his lawyers be at the courts by midnight or something along those lines. Yeah.
In my opinion, it is an extreme disservice to an institution that is crucial in this republic, the whole notion that the framers had of an independent federal judiciary. Now, we're not always going to agree with what the justices decide. And the justices do not always get it right. I mean, they have made some historically bad decisions, Dred Scott versus Sanford, Plessy versus Ferguson, you know, based really on racism and sexism. So we've had bad decisions. But the people, and this is part of what Gore was saying 20 years ago, the people have to respect the rule of law based on the trust they have in an institution that is supposed to be independent. And I think President Trump, frankly, crossed that line earlier this fall. When you recall, this was shortly before, as history would have it, Justice Ginsburg passed away. He publicized a list of 20 names in advance of, there wasn't a vacancy at the time. And Amy Coney Barrett was on that list and believed to be a front runner because she was somewhat of a finalist when Brett Kavanaugh was selected. So I do not, I think the Supreme Court is walking very dangerously in terms of its credibility as an institution when a paramount vote or a paramount right in a democracy is the right to vote. And if that right is restricted after the game has been played, after the election has been conducted, particularly to a crowd that touts originalism and deference to elected state legislatures. They make the election rules, not federal judges who have lifetime tenure. So I cringe at the thought of an election dispute going to the Supreme Court under these conditions. I think the whole perception that President Trump has fueled is that if called upon, the justices will have his back and take care of him. And I think that is just an awful perception for a critical institution in this country. So that would be my own humble opinion on that issue.
Very interesting, very interesting. I have one last question. I would love to have other people in the group ask questions if they want, but so you brought up the public financing of campaigns when you're talking about the checklist of things we need changes. And I'm wondering what you see as the challenges there. I know, of course, we have Citizens United, but then there's also the precedent set by the Obama 08 campaign of rejecting, I believe I'm correct on this, but rejecting the federal funds in order to achieve greater funds from private donors. Yes, currently now, I believe this is the election has the most money in it ever, and every year we've been seeing that. I'm wondering what you think which one's the bigger hurdle to jump over? Is it that precedent set by the Obama campaign, or is it Citizens United, or is it a combination of both?
Well, actually, the precedent, or what Barack Obama did in 2008 wasn't a precedent because George W. Bush, John Kerry, and Howard Dean had done it earlier. And so what that is a recognition that they could actually raise more money. In the past, candidates, especially lower tier candidates, really relied on those public match funds during the primaries. And some candidates realized that was a hindrance to them. And you are absolutely right. Every 4 years, we seemingly double the total spending for all federal races. And these are early figures, and so we don't have the definitive numbers yet. It's widely believed that 4 years ago, total spending in all federal races amounted to about $37.50 per voter. And in this campaign, it'll likely be $75, doubling that. We're on target to spend about $11 billion for the presidential race, the 435 House seats, and the 35 Senate races. So to me, the biggest issue is Citizens United by far, because I personally do not believe that corporations, which are inanimate objects by definition, they're bricks and mortar in the presumed sense of the term, have the same type of free speech rights as individuals. And I think it's not a new precedent established by the justices, but I think, read Justice John Paul Stevens, who recently passed away. He was a Republican appointed by Jerry Ford. Read his dissent. And I think it's very interesting because it's historically based that, he presented that was a very dangerous thing, that a very dangerous idea that the justices created decades earlier. there is a perception, and by the way, I would cite the late Senator John McCain on this issue, because he was he was a Republican nominee in 2008. He was in a very small group of Republicans, and he truly was on, most Democrats support publicly financed campaigns. John McCain did too. He was a very big student of Teddy Roosevelt, former Republican president. And what he concluded is that Roosevelt was right. Roosevelt said the perception is our leaders are bought and paid off. And that doesn't work well in a democracy. So, he said that over 100 years ago. McCain used to say the same thing, that the perception is real. We can debate whether or not politicians are bought and paid off. I think political scientists would tell you is that individuals, PACs invest in like-minded people. So they're not going to give money. If you're a progressive, you're probably not giving money to Donald Trump and vice versa. But so we can debate that. The perception is very real, that the government is only listening to the rich and powerful, and the rest of us have little or no influence whatsoever. And so I think, to me, Citizens United is I would agree with the late Justice Ginsburg, who said it was the worst decision in modern history. Again, that's one opinion from the sidelines, okay?
Yeah, totally. Well, thank you very much. I don't have any other questions, but I like to ask everyone else if they have any questions. But that was a very well-rounded and insightful discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Declan. Any other questions?